Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. Welcome
Oh,
to UKGI Live. I'm Dave Anderson, Head of Technical for UKGI, and I'm joined by the gentleman on screen with me.
hello, I'm Rob Knowles, one of the compliance consultants here at UKGI.
And today we're going to be talking about customer vulnerability. If there's any questions that crop up throughout the course of the session, pop them in the chat, or not the chat, rather, pop them in the Q&A, and we'll try and summarize them afterwards because we've got quite a lot of material to get through. And I'm conscious that I want to try and stick to time, and I'd like to get through the material as quickly as possible and efficiently as possible, accepting that there's no chance we're going to be able to cover everything we would really want to talk about in 30 minutes. But with no further ado, today's learning objectives. By the end of today's session, you will be able to understand the regulatory and ethical considerations in relation to vulnerability, describe the FCA's drivers of vulnerability, identify circumstances which might lead to vulnerability for clients, and explain the practical measures to support vulnerable customers. So, who are the vulnerable? What's a vulnerable customer? The FCA defines a vulnerable customer as someone who, due to their personal circumstances, is especially susceptible to detriment, particularly when a firm is not acting with appropriate levels of care. That also includes customers and prospective customers, natural persons, including individuals and business customers, non-incorporated, and acknowledge individual representatives of commercial clients that may have vulnerable characteristics as well. So vulnerability can be permanent or temporary. An individual may experience temporary vulnerability in circumstances such as bereavement, mental health. It's important to be able to differentiate between the two and have systems in place to be able to help customers in understanding where they may be experiencing vulnerability and could perhaps benefit from adjustments or aspects of a product or service that they may not otherwise be aware of. And we'll try and talk about some of those examples as we go through today's slides. There are regulatory and ethical obligations for you as firms. So fair treatment it's all important here. It's amplified and elevated through the consumer duty for sure. Nothing's different from a rules perspective. The requirement is for you to ensure that people who are less able to understand for whatever reason do not suffer because of a vulnerability or propensity to experience detriment. So you do have to work harder to make sure that these customers are treated fairly. It's perhaps wise to initially take a step back and consider how you think about vulnerability. Think about what customers need in terms of solutions, and that approach would work broadly for all customers. How are staff trained to deal with vulnerability? Has that training been reviewed, and is the training still appropriate? How do you identify customers who might display characteristics of vulnerability? Do staff understand the impact of these characteristics and how you can make reasonable adjustments to your processes, communications, and support the overall customer experience? And can this be done in a consistent and repeatable way? And that's an important point as well, which we'll circle back to you. How do you record this information? How are the outcomes of these customers monitored? The FCA has some high-level principles you should all be aware of. It's clear that, leaving the huge amount of words in the FCA's handbook aside just for one moment, the FCA broadly wants firms to do the right thing. All of this stuff that we'll discuss today is good practice, and it's the stuff that's going to keep you in business. The most relevant principles are noted on this slide, and they're particularly relevant to what we're talking about today. So skill, care and diligence, acting in the customer's best interests, clear communications, fair treatment, and the overarching duty to ensure good outcomes for customers. And as a reminder, something, if you're ever going to breach anything in relation to FCA regulations, breaches will occur. Let it be a breach of a rule and not a principle. So the treatment of vulnerable customers, the FCA's review, in line with the 2021 commitment, earlier this year, the FCA carried out a review of firms' treatment of vulnerable customers. The survey was voluntary. Firms were encouraged to participate, and I think we can expect that further work will be a requirement for those firms asked to be involved. The survey was relatively in-depth. It requested information around the firm's customer mix, product spread, asked firms to describe the actions they'd already taken to ensure good outcomes, requested information around staff training, product testing, the review process firms are maintaining to ensure vulnerable customers are treated properly. There were questions associated with the type of MI firms are using, perhaps indicating that repositioning and repackaging existing MI might not be appropriate. The questions around whether firms are using AI or artificial intelligence or big data to help inform their approach to vulnerable customers. The FCA also notes that it's going to examine the outcomes of customers in vulnerable circumstances to test whether they're as good as the outcomes received by other consumers. And it's going to assess this by undertaking consumer research and gathering information from firms and consumer representatives. Circle back to 2017 when the regulator initially suggested it was going to focus solely on age-related issues. It's now issued further clarification that the review will look broadly at how firms treat customers, including older customers, in vulnerable circumstances to evaluate whether consumers most at risk of harm are receiving good outcomes. There's lots of guidance the FCA has provided for firms on the fair treatment of vulnerable customers, and particularly in relation to the implementation of the consumer duty. We're not going to focus too much on the consumer duty today, but we were never going to get away from it. Under the duty, it's clear that customer vulnerability should be considered at each stage of the product life cycle, and that firms should be acting to ensure that vulnerable customers are receiving at least as good outcomes as other customers throughout their customer journeys. Our advice is to treat this as an outcome perhaps under the duty in its own right and feature it with prominence in the board report, which will be prepared before the end of this month. The needs of vulnerable customers, they will vary. Some will require additional measures to ensure the right outcome is reached. If the needs are not understood, then you're not really able to take them into account in product design, customer service, or communications, and that could lead to poor outcomes for those customers. The FCA expects firms to understand the nature and scale of vulnerability within their customer base, and the impact of that vulnerability on the needs of their customers and how it might affect the customer experience and the outcomes they'll ultimately receive. So it's essential that you record the information in relation to vulnerability adequately and in a repeatable and reportable format so that the customer doesn't have to explain the details of the vulnerability every time they contact you. In some cases, depending on the vulnerability and the circumstances, that could even be traumatic for the individual clients. And either way, it's not a good outcome. The main drivers remain the same: health conditions or illness that affect the ability to carry out day-to-day tasks, life events, including major life events such as bereavement, job loss, or relationship breakdown, resilience, low ability to withstand financial or emotional shocks. And I think financial resilience is probably prevalent at the moment and something that's reflected in FOS figures recently in the uplifting complaints they've seen in those areas. And capability, so low knowledge of financial matters or confidence in managing money, or low capability in other areas. Robin, do you want to give us some examples of vulnerability?
Yeah, so following on from the last slide, you can clearly see the table in front of you giving you some accurate examples of vulnerability. But I think what firms also need to consider are hidden vulnerabilities, such as things like mental health issues, neurodiversity, chronic pain, those sort of things. These can often go unnoticed, but will significantly impact customers' ability to engage with services. So a lot of staff should be trained to recognise and respect indicators of these hidden disabilities. Providing appropriate assistance without making assumptions or judgments. I think it's paramount to keep in mind that disabilities are not immediately apparent, and we should all sort of aim to create an inclusive environment, offering reasonable adjustments and fostering that open communication with our customers.
Yeah, remember not all customers may actually see themselves as vulnerable, particularly where they are experiencing short-term vulnerability. There's a firm we worked with quite recently. They identified the need to help customers better understand the characteristics of a vulnerable customer to enable them to self-identify if they may be experiencing even those short-term vulnerabilities during the term of the PMI policy in this case. And to address that, the firm took steps to better educate both customers and staff to interact and discuss and understand, and that enhanced understanding helped customers realize how and when they might be able to benefit from features of their policy, even in situations where they might not initially, be able to connect the dots themselves. And it's also important to consider where there's perhaps a sliding scale of vulnerability in some circumstances, where over time the circumstances behind the vulnerability could worsen, and that could drive the need for increased levels of support, or they could improve and dilute the level of support that's required, or even it could even completely be removed.
Yeah. So I suppose this is the big question: why are we identifying vulnerable customers? Identifying them is the first step to providing that appropriate support. And as we've said in some of the previous slides so far, vulnerability can arise from various factors such as poor health, cognitive impairments, life events like bereavement or job loss, low resilience to financial or emotional shocks, and low capability in literacy or numeracy. So signs of vulnerability may include difficulty in understanding information, frequent missed payments, expressions of distress during interactions, and to reiterate what I said previously, it's essential to train your frontline staff to recognize these signs and respond empathetically.
Just really quickly, just to interject there as well, it's something that may not be generally aware, but there are resources available online that will tell you the readability scores or the average reading age and understandability of a particular document or a piece of communication, and that's something that we've seen firms successfully implement the use of.
Yeah. And I think it goes without saying, you'll get a better understanding of a customer's individual circumstances if you tailor services to meet the specific needs of those customers. And ultimately, if you have insufficient resources and training to be able to identify vulnerability, then you're ultimately falling at the first hurdle. Things to think about. For example, if a customer has a memory problem, is it probably going to be better to communicate with them in writing, where there's a written trail of correspondence? And it's all good and well talking about identifying vulnerable customers and having policies and procedures in place for these sort of things. But I think what you've got to keep in mind, and all of anyone involved with customers should keep in mind, is you've got to put yourself in that person's shoes. If it was a close family member or yourself that was a vulnerable customer, how would you want to be treated?
Close family member test. I like it.
I think firms should be well experienced in asking questions to understand a client's demands and needs. I mean, there's a lot of brokers on here. We've all done broking at some point, and assessing those client demands and needs, that's part of the day-to-day life of arranging insurance for someone. And it should ensure that you should ensure that training is in place for your staff, and that it's appropriate and supports staff to engage with clients in a way that allows them to identify any potential trigger or vulnerability, and the time it takes to understand so that clients' needs can be considered. Some example indicators, age, for example. A lot of people immediately assume elderly, and I hate assuming these sort of things, because you do have to consider the other end of the scale. Someone very young who's not experienced in insurance may also potentially be a vulnerable customer.
You got living with dementia as well. There's obviously very often no physical signs. They may not be experiencing systems when you interact with them, or duress from a third party, and that can be difficult to identify if it's not disclosed. There could be coercive control in the background, or economic abuse even. Yeah. And then dealing with vulnerability. So managing vulnerable customers, it does require a tailored approach, and I feel that larger firms should potentially have specialist teams that are trained to handle sensitive conversations and provide that customized support for the customer. This can include things like offering clear and simple communication, flexible payment options, and signposting to not only internal but external support services where and when necessary. Regular training, again, this is absolutely vital for staff on best practices and new regulations. Ensuring fair treatment and good outcomes for all customers, not just necessarily vulnerable customers. This is something you should have implemented in your business across the board. Ultimately, regulators do say that it's a key priority to protect vulnerable customers, and totally agree with that. And for your firm as well, I think it's important to just create that culture of empathy and understanding. It's vital that we all connect on a human level with our customers. So just to reiterate that, establishing specialist teams to handle sensitive cases, that can be quite a lifeline in a situation that may prove difficult to deal with. If you've got a specialist team that know how to deal with that, it can be passed over to them. And again, offering that customized assistance based on individual needs, very important. Yeah, and if it's not appropriate for firms to perhaps appoint teams to deal with, sensitive cases. Have perhaps, like we did with the consumer duty champion in firms, a vulnerable customer champion that's supported with appropriate training. They could be a focal point for those clients as you deal with them. And then, some of the customized assistance based on the individual needs. We've seen many firms happy to issue communication in braille or large print. But perhaps sometimes spending a bit of additional time with customers to explain things in a different way, adding breathing space into call scripts or customer journeys. Firms should be able to list their available interventions and keep a record of those so they are repeatable.
Yeah. And ultimately, the FCA remains focused on the actions that firms are taking to understand and respond to the needs of customers in vulnerable circumstances. And they are particularly interested in, firms' understanding of consumer needs, the skills and capability of staff. We're going to be talking about that in the next slides. Product and service design, communication and customer service, whether the elements that I've just listed support the fair treatment of customers in vulnerable circumstances. So, I cannot reiterate enough. I know I've said it about 3 times already, but it is essential that staff have appropriate training to enable them to identify and deal with vulnerable customers, whether that's, temporary vulnerability or a longer term, more permanent vulnerability. When vulnerable customers are identified, it gives the firm a better understanding of how to individually support the customer for their specific needs. And the identification and treatment of vulnerable customers is about supporting them to experience the same levels of understanding and independence that other customers may have with your firm.
And spoiler alert, appropriate training is probably going to be mentioned again throughout the session. So, looking at skill and capability of staff, the fair treatment of vulnerable customers should be embedded across all departments. So relevant staff understand how their role impacts the treatment of vulnerable customers. Staff should be trained to understand and consider the needs of vulnerable customers. So, they're aware of the options and adaptations they can offer to, respond flexibly. Senior management creates and champions a culture of prioritizing the fair treatment of vulnerable customers, and culture is going to be absolutely essential, and it is perhaps in its own right something that should be looked at as an outcome under the duty. Who's going to review the policies and procedures, the governance systems and controls to ensure they offer sufficient support to staff to meet the needs of vulnerable customers in their roles? Do staff have the skills and capability needed to recognise and respond to characteristics of vulnerability? Whether customers told them about a need, whether any clear indicators of vulnerability, or is there relevant information on file indicating the additional need, treatment, or the vulnerability itself? Do they offer practical and emotional support to customer-facing staff who deal with vulnerable customers, and staff, know when it's appropriate to obtain additional support and how to obtain it? Who do they go to? And, are they getting trained right? Training could include updated induction plans and ongoing staff training to include specific vulnerability training that could be tailored if you do identify a vulnerability champion. Sharing published materials on vulnerability, joining webinars like today's, developing policies and how-to guides that staff can use in their day-to-day roles, holding informal information sharing sessions or consistency sessions, perhaps where you'll play call recordings that demonstrate instances of vulnerability, so they can share the knowledge that supports the development of best practice, and appoint that dedicated vulnerability champions who can help discuss complex cases and support frontline staff in the treatment and good practice there. Interacting with vulnerable customers, it's really important to be patient and empathise, actively listen and ask open questions, acknowledge what the customer says and be compassionate, slow down, use plain English and avoid jargon. We should avoid jargon anyway. Repeat it back to check understanding and ask the customer to replay their understanding of their interaction with you. That's really important as well in terms of gathering customer feedback. That step of not just asking, did you understand? What did you understand about what we've just told you? And that will give you much more meaningful insight that you can feed into, showing how you evolve your customer outcomes. Ask if there's anyone else the customer needs to speak to. Is there a power of attorney in place? Do they need to bring in a family member or a trusted friend? Ask sensitive questions delicately. Allow the customer to arrive at their own decisions, Ask if perhaps there's a better time to call to discuss the matter, and stay calm and refer to help if if you need it. It's important to avoid rushing the customer in these circumstances. Avoid interrupting them or jumping in with a tendency to want to finish off their sentences. And as Robin said earlier, don't assume you already know what their requirements or needs are, and don't assume that silence means no to your question. It might just be an indication of further clarification being required. Robin, do you want to give us an update on dealing with third parties and some of the key considerations?
Yeah, so I'm sure this has happened to some of you that are attending this webinar. In the event that an unauthorized third party contacts you and discloses information that may imply one of your customers is vulnerable, this could include family members, friends, organizations that are dealing on their behalf. This is where the CARERS acronym should be followed. So for those of you that haven't seen this, and I'm sure you probably have seen this, the CARERS acronym, CARERS. So as it clearly states on here, check for authority, avoid discussing any sort of details around the customer, reassure the carer that it will be looked into, explain their observations will need to be shared with the customer, record their observations, and summarize the next steps. It's important to follow these, particularly when dealing with unauthorized third parties, because obviously you don't want to be breaching data.
Yeah. And then summarising the next available steps, that might include, you or a colleague speaking with a customer concerned to establish if there's a problem, including checking the, unverified observations made by the carer discussing with the customer a potential mandate to act on their behalf, and the carer and the customer working together to collect supporting medical evidence to allow the interaction to continue through that vein.
Mm. And this is where it gets a little sticky.
This is Robin's specialist subject, though. So this is his passion.
Yeah. So I mean, ultimately, you got to think: how do you currently flag vulnerabilities in your systems? Flag on the system may be considered, but if you suspect vulnerability, you'll generally need explicit consent to record special category data. So for special category data, I'll cover that in a second for those that don't know what it is, but ultimately what you've got to think about is safeguarding vulnerable customers' information is paramount. Storing sensitive data necessitates stringent adherence to data protection laws, and these laws are designed to respect the privacy and security of individuals. So recording explicit vulnerabilities can lead to potential misuse or unintended disclosure, thereby increasing the risk of harm to the customer. So instead, it might be worthwhile focusing on what support customers will need without explicitly detailing their vulnerability to potentially mitigate these risks. So bringing it over to special category data. So for those that don't know what special category data is, it's a subset of personal data that is considered more sensitive and therefore requires extra protection. So UK GDPR defines what I'll refer to as SCD from now on, defines SCD as data revealing racial or ethnic origin, political opinions, religious or philosophical beliefs, trade union membership, genetic data, biometric data where it's been used for identification purposes, data concerning health, data concerning a person's sex life, and data concerning a person's sexual orientation. So the reason this data is special is not just because it might be seen as more sensitive or private. The recitals to the UK GDPR explain that these types of personal data merit specific protection because the use of this data could create significant risks to an individual's fundamental rights and freedoms. Now, I'm not going to go through what people's individual rights and freedoms are because we'll be here for another 2-3 hours. But feel free to look those up, or if you have further questions on that, feel free to ask them after the webinar. But in the context of vulnerability, information pertaining to vulnerability is most likely to be caught by GDPR SCD rules if it falls within a health category. However, I would caveat that with data relating to financial vulnerability, such as low income, income shock, non-health related change in circumstances, and so on, may not necessarily be SCD. This is why it's important to read and understand this stuff. So it is important to note that if special category data is compromised, it has the potential for greater financial, physical, emotional, or reputational harm. Therefore, SCD is considered higher risk data. And if a breach involves data of this nature, it is more likely to reach the bar for reporting. And it's also more likely to reach the threshold of needing to notify those affected.
Absolutely. And the individual senior managers at the firm would be the ones that would be culpable for that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So as you can see here, absolutely vital that you do not refer to a customer as vulnerable in your interactions with them. Nobody likes being labeled, particularly someone that may have a vulnerability, because it's, it may essentially be a constant reminder of their vulnerability. So just think about that before you start talking and interacting with a vulnerable customer. And absolutely obtain consent every single time. There's a great example on the screen there. Are you okay for me to note what you've told me on your records? That should be a question sitting in your mind the moment you feel that you're speaking with a vulnerable customer. Again, if you can't gain consent, but you have reason to believe that they have vulnerable characteristics, just leave a factual appropriate note. You don't have to go into too much detail on it, but facts are important. Never assume, always state the facts.
Okay, so recording and reporting. The FCA expects firms to regularly monitor whether they're achieving the right outcomes for vulnerable customers. Monitoring should already be in existence, and it should focus on the processes that work well and those that need adapting or improvements in terms of the outcomes for vulnerable customers. Your firms are required to implement appropriate processes to evaluate where they've not met the needs of vulnerable customers so that they can make improvements, and produce and regularly review MI appropriate to the nature of their business for the outcomes they are delivering for vulnerable customers. There's no escaping it. The consumer duty was bound to come back into the conversation in some way, shape, or form. It's an area that the FCA feels firms are falling down on in relation to vulnerable customers. Firms really need to showcase the understanding of the concept and what they're doing to protect these customers. Hand on heart today, can you answer the question, what percentage of your client base is vulnerable? If you've got, if you deal in personal lines and you've got 20,000 clients, but you have recorded 10 or 15 vulnerable customers over the course of the last 12 months, then perhaps that's an indicator of disproportionality. Then you need to delve into that in more detail. Do you really understand your client base as a demographic? Commercial customers, if you deal with commercial customers, you don't have to worry about vulnerability. Well, that's wrong. We know that small and medium-sized commercial firms can be classed as vulnerable. Think about, family-run firms where a family member passes away, a medium-sized firm who lose a large contract and suddenly can't afford their overheads. That all falls into the concept of vulnerability, as perhaps does, a wholesale intermediary dealing with brokers that have individuals there that could experience vulnerability, and the decisions they take could have an onward impact throughout the distribution chain to their consumers as well. So there's lots that need to be considered. Boards, because you're as SMFs, as the governing body of a firm, you're ultimately accountable for this. You need to assure yourselves that the customers are being correctly identified, and when they are identified, that they're receiving as good outcomes as other customers. That means that you should be able to compare the MI for vulnerable customers against that of other types of customer. If you can't do this, then you can't determine what outcomes those customers are getting, so you're falling short of the mark there. Think about what MI is available to demonstrate this. Don't try and repurpose and repackage what's already there. Think about what you really need to see to be the real indicators here. Do you have suitable training in place to allow staff to spot vulnerability? I told you we'd mention it again, and we can help in that arena if you don't. Do you have the processes in place to accommodate those customers once they're identified? How is it reported? Are you able to extract that data? Could you output a report should the regulator ask to see one? And, invariably they may. Is QA carried out when you identify vulnerability? Boards need to be honest about their answers in relation to these questions. Don't just assume that everything's fine the way it is. If you can't evidence to the FCA that vulnerable customers are being treated fairly, then they'll naturally assume that they're not. And the FCA is going to be reviewing how well firms are going on this subject. So that, in good time, has taken us through what's been a whistle-stop tour of vulnerable customers. And hopefully by now we've been able to signpost to understanding the regulatory and ethical considerations, describe the FCA's drivers of vulnerability, how to identify circumstances which might lead to vulnerability, and explaining some practical measures for considerations for vulnerable customers. Just that key point I made at the start of the session, that first step might be just to just look broadly about what your customers need in terms of solutions, and then look for any opportunities to better record and increase the consistency of the interventions that you bring in to support customers with vulnerability. That would be a massive win, and something that would be great if you could document that in your board reports. Robin, have you got anything to add?
Just to caveat back, never assume. I think that's quite an important point, and I think it's often something that happens quite a lot in society. Even outside of insurance, we see something and then we make assumptions. So going into this, remove those assumptions from your head. Have a plan in place.
Wise words. Thanks for attending today. I'm guessing the majority of people have already signed up to the UKGI Live mailing list, otherwise you wouldn't be on here. But if you haven't, please do sign up. We'll share more information about our next Lunch and Learn webinar, which is going to be happening in August. They're going to be coming up once a month, but details of the date and the topics will be circulated through that mailing list. If this has prompted any questions or queries, any takeaways for you that you think you might need to act upon, or simply you need more information or support with any compliance or training matters, please contact info@ukgigroup.com, and we'd absolutely love to have a chat with you. But yeah, thank you very much for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your Thursday. Take care, everyone.